and welcome to What a Scream, the podcast where I, your host, Golly Miss Dolly, chats with a special guest every week about horror films. Now, previous to recording, I pick out a theme or a subject completely randomly, and we each have to choose a film that kind of has to do with that theme or subject. So this week, and I feel like I say this a lot, it's almost like I'm not a fan of horror, but I am. The theme this week, I'm not a massive fan of this particular subgenre. It's one that I can kind of take or leave a lot of the time. I think the horror market is super oversaturated with this genre of horror. So it is the 80s slasher film. The 80s slasher... So the kind of golden age of slasher was from 1978 till 1984, but it was kind of in the 80s where it really amped up. You know, it was a point at which censorship was kind of dropping a lot, so there was a lot of influx of like sex and gore in horror. It kind of started out with a lot of horror films from the 70s like Black Christmas and of course Halloween. But if we go back a little further, you can see a lot of influence from Alfred Hitchcock, stuff like Peeping Tom, not Teeping Pom, Peeping Tom, and of course the Italian Giallo. So in these slasher films, we usually see a masked killer or an unknown killer kind of stalking and murdering groups of people, usually teenagers, usually teenage girls. And they are usually kind of spurred on by perhaps a traumatic past event that like a commemoration or an anniversary has kind of come up, and they snap and go on mad killing sprees. The 80s slasher really cemented the trope of the final girl, so that end girl who has to face off against the murderer or the monster. And we also had fabulous tropes such as if you have sex, you die. It's a bit of a strange time in horror kind of feminist theory because, you know, is the slasher feminist because there's the final girl who has to fight? Or is it misogynistic because it was quite exploitative? It's, you know, the whole idea that if you're not a virgin and pure and perfect, then you're gonna die. So yeah, that's my take on slashers. I think that's why I don't like them that much. But yeah, we'll see. I guess we'll see in this chat. Perhaps my mind will be changed. I doubt it. So the two movies that myself and my guests are going to be covering this week is The Slumber Party Massacre and The House on Sorority Row, both from 1982. My guest this week is Alice Apparently, who is a burlesque performer. They are a musician, they are an academic, and they are the current reigning Mix Horror Ireland. So here it is, my chat with Alice Apparently about 80s slashers. So I would like to introduce to the podcast Shauna Caffrey, aka Alice Apparently. How are you?
I am very well, thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here.
It feels so weird because we haven't seen each other since February of 2020.
I know, because I was about to say the last time we were due to see each other was actually the night before lockdown. Yeah. Yeah, I think about it. Yeah, before the world stood still.
Yeah. Unfortunately, your debut kind of show with producing, it was the last show of Dublin Burlesque and Cabaret.
I felt like it was this was my show, Bleeding Deadly, a cabaret for the end times. I was maybe a little bit too on the nose with the show title. But yeah, we were the last show in Dublin before global lockdown. So I think potentially the last burlesque show in Ireland before global, like before a full nationwide lockdown. So suitable for a horror show, but also felt kind of bad. I was like, did we do this? Did we? Is it our fault?
For anyone that doesn't know who you are, would you like to give us a little bit about yourself and who you are?
Yes, absolutely. So my name is Shauna Caffrey, or Shauna Louise Caffrey in academic publications. I go by Alice apparently in stage and performance circles. I am a burlesque and cabaret performer also. As we just mentioned, I produced my first show, Bleeding Deadly, just before the before lockdown, before COVID. And I'm also in my day-to-day life, I am a PhD researcher. My research topic is witchcraft, music and magic on the 17th century stage. So it's pretty much the accumulation of a lifelong love of all things occult and spooky and a little bit off the beaten track, and theatrical, which I feel is going to be important for today's topic.
And do you remember when you first started getting into horror and what got you into like the spookier, darker side of life?
I think it's kind of it's one of those things where it's kind of like asking, like, when did you start breathing air? Where I know, like, from a not so much from a horror perspective, but from a, like, when I was growing up, like as a kid, we were like just completely gorged on like folk tales, fairy tales, mythology, all of that. And I always kind of gravitated a bit towards the spookier side of folklore, which I think is just in a lot of cases like this, there's so much in terms of like folklore that is so much more spooky, and it's so much more interesting because it's so much different to our everyday life. And so when I hit my, like, basically as long as I can remember reading books and listening to audiobooks, there's always been some kind of horror trend there. Like, I remember reading Dracula when I was probably way too young to read Dracula. And then as a result of that, it kind of started to feed into like what movies I was watching. And I'm lucky in that I am the older sibling, so I can't say I ever had an older sibling to give me horror recommendations or to watch horror with. But I'm really lucky in that my parents were always very like, they weren't like very kind of overly protective, and they were kind of, look, if you were mature enough to watch something, like, you can, you know, if there's anything that we're worried about, we'll flag it with you. But if you ever come across anything in anything you're reading or anything you watch that you have questions about or you don't understand or you're worried about, come talk to us. But yeah, it's kind of been like I say, as long as I can remember, there's always been skeletons in the closet.
Yeah. And do you remember what the first horror movie was that had the most profound effect on you?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think actually, if I think about like texts that have really just always stood with me, it's like the ones that are really, really profound would be the Frankenstein with Boris Karloff. That was just because I think that started a kind of fascination, particularly when you're very young. And Frankenstein as a seminal text is one of those first ones where we start to get into like the psychology of the monster and that idea of like, let's have a look at the monsters from a slightly different perspective, and which I think is something that we actually start to explore. Again, comes into monsters. But yeah, I think definitely a lot of the classic. I love, as a general rule, the hammier. I love a really good like chilling scare, but as a general rule, and like for comfort watches and just all around fun, the hammier the horror, like hammy, schlocky, kitschy horror is just like not actual bad horror, but like bad horror.
Yeah.
I think I'm hoping the audience gets what I mean.
Yes. So do you think your love of horror has kind of, and you know, the type of horror that you into, do you think it has influenced your art and your performance and kind of the general direction you've gone in your adult life? Like, I know the answer to this.
Yeah, when you saw me in person, I think I had just turned back from being a werewolf. So I think for anyone not familiar with me, my burlesque and performance art side of things would predominantly be very much in the kind of horror and gorelesque side of things, as well as like it's either like classical burlesque or it's absolute gore. There's no in between. We don't do the middle ground here. What's that? So there is a lot of demonic possession. There's a lot of I think actually the most booked routine before the world slowed down a little, which is it's quite nice, is my Howl routine, which is very much inspired by actually probably my favorite one of my favorite horror movies, The Wolfman. So I transform back from a werewolf into a human. It's very fun. There's a lot of gore. I get to scream a lot, which is normally not. Normally, you don't get to do that in pubs. And I mean, even from a musical standpoint, like as a musical performer, I'm involved with. I say involved with. I'm one of the founding members of an experimental music group called Analog On, and while it's not explicitly horror themed, like because it's experimental music, we use a lot of like synthesizers, theremins, stuff like that. So there is a significant overlap with like the soundscapes of early like B movies and science fiction movies and horror. A lot of like, specialty. So it's kind of one of those things where it just filters into as much, and obviously I'm a very normal person when it comes to, fashion and outward appearances. For anyone who's listening, I'm definitely dressed like a 1950s housewife. But, it is one of those things that it clearly had a big aesthetic effect, as well as like from, the tropes and themes that you're able to exploit in performance. And also, like I say, from my academic career, there's obviously a massive overlap between my love of horror and all things spooky, and the fact that I'm looking at the early origins of witchcraft on stage, but on operatic stage. Like it's very much linked to, I think it's just that case where I was like, it got me young.
Let's chat about our theme for this week. So the random subject that I pulled out was 80s slashers. How do you feel about slashers from the 1980s?
They wouldn't be like not in a like, God, I hate slashers. I love 80s slashers, like really love them. Like I was saying earlier about like that idea of like horror and theatricality is just one of the huge things that draws me toward 80s slashers. In a lot of cases, they fall into that. I don't believe in guilty pleasures, but guilty pleasure kind of zone, where they're kind of like, there's so many of them that are what I would call like bad horror, but in the good way. Where they're trashy and like schlocky, and they're so camp in so many ways. So while they wouldn't necessarily be like, like when I think about horror, the kind of horror that I naturally gravitate to, or like my go-to subgenre would be like, folk horror is kind of big time my jam. But like 80s slashers are kind of like a comfort food. They're like a comfort horror. For the most part, except Halloween, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. It's up there. I can't help it. It's Jamie Curtis. I love it.
Like, I'm not a fan of 80s slashers. I'm not really a fan of slashers in general. I like them when they've got a little bit of a twist to them, or perhaps a little bit of a supernatural twist, say like Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street. But I can't get behind just some fella going around killing people. Like I'm just like, I like, you know what I like? I like watching the kills. I love seeing the kind of the creativity behind killing, especially when you've got people behind it such as Tom Savini, who was, instrumental in a lot of 80s slashers and the special effects he used. But other than that, I'm like, I find that they really suffer from really bad storylines, and I just cannot get behind it.
Oh yeah, like and this is one of the things that I think, for me at least, is one of those kind of that why it's like that, almost that thing that I would think of as comfort horror, is there is so clearly a formula that you know what's going to happen, you have an idea, you're not necessarily watching it for, not to say you're not watching it for the plot, because some of them have like every so often a slasher just comes and knocks you out of the park, and you're like, wow. And I think as well, that's part of the reason that like later slashers, like when you get things like Scream and stuff like that, are so interesting because they play with that formula and they play with those tropes. But when you watch a lot of like early 80s slashers, like you can't watch a lot of them together or in one after the other, because it can become very repetitive very quickly. And that, it is that kind of thing where, to some extent, it is that kind of like almost like the summer blockbuster type formula where you think like, okay, they're being churned out and they're easy to do because they don't necessarily require as much as much of a budget as, say, for example, like a lot of supernatural horror might. Because I know a lot of people say like, oh, if you're doing your first movie, a lot of the time it's really easy to start off doing a zombie movie because all you need is a load of extras and get them to shamble around. But like the next on the step up is like, do a slasher movie because you just need a bucket of blood and a guy in a mask and a lot of screaming teenagers and a banging soundtrack. I was like, this is my formula for movies. This is how you get the teens into the cinema.
So what kind of society and culture do you think that the genre kind of came out of? I mean, when we look at, how George A. Romero, his zombie kind of genre came out, we know fully, it was from like the war and kind of like this kind of culture that was becoming a lot more capitalist. And what kind of society did the 1980s slasher come out of?
Well, from my own perspective, like on a kind of ground, I say a ground, it's not going to be grand. From my own perspective, a lot of the tropes that we see cropping up in like slasher horror really comes out of a lot of this anxiety that we had post. Given that it was they were to some extent products of the like 70s into like late 70s into 80s, there's a lot of this effectively like post flower child morality where we suddenly see this like this kind of sexual freedom and idea of like a loosening moral grip on predominantly American youth, because let's face it, they're all set at American summer camps or sororities or slumber parties or I've never seen a slasher in Ireland, like, put it that way. It was only Michael from down the road. The one with the mask. Could you imagine? It just wouldn't work. And it is very much that idea of like, they're so much entrenched in that kind of teen culture, but also this kind of like cultural fear around the loosening of morals and effectively that kind of like loss of family values. And that, to be fair, it's that kind of thing of at the period. That's a lot of what you heard being said, but any period, like it's the same thing that, naysayers say now about kids playing video games. It's the lot, children don't know how to socialize and, the brain, it's that perpetual societal fear of the loss of values and stability and we're all becoming godless. And also you have that like little filtering in of, some kind of supernatural elements with like the likes of the Satanic Panic, which doesn't quite so much come into the slasher movies as it does others. But, there's still that kind of fear there of what if something's possessed and these questions about like innate evil that really shaped them into what they are. And I think that in my mind is kind of the melting pot that these this end product formula. I mean, there's obviously lots more to be read in here, and I know there's a lot of academic work that will go into and I can't remember the name. Find the name and send it to you. There was someone who was writing about slashers and specifically the periods of American politics.
It's like what is it called? It's like chainsaws, women and men, like gender that one. And there is also a conference coming up called the Slasher Studies Summer Camp, which I'm looking forward to attend and hopefully learn a bit more about that political background. But that's kind of, from my perspective as when it comes to cultural history, there's obviously a lot of those kind of threads that are
there's certain broad strokes that you have to make, but there are some of the very clear anxieties. Like even if you look at headlines from the 1980s, it's, you know, it's all of this kind of like breakdown of the family unit, you know, breakdown of the family unit, youths having too much freedom. What will they do with that freedom? And also then things like, you know, like also this kind of you know, almost like almost like a clapback against the ideas of sexual revolution, and you know, also that kind of never quite explicitly stated, but the mounting concerns about like you know, sexually transmitted diseases and you know, related pandemics and things like that, that made it kind of like a perfect storm, and to some extent I think also a genre that could be and has been exploited to kind of churn out some very overtly patriarchal and if not just downright misogynist movies, and I mean, this is as well as one of those things where in some cases you can like there can be an element of parody in some of those depictions of the world, but you know, you have to question how much of this is coming from, you know, where is this coming from? How can you interpret it from both sides? So and
because of these kind of cultural pushbacks on horror, some of the very big pinnacle stereotypes and tropes that we now know as very common horror tropes were actually developed from the 80s slasher. So we've got this idea of kind of like, you know, if you have sex, you'll die. If you do drugs, you'll die. If you do anything where you're not virginal or book smart or anything, you know, you're gonna die. The killer's gonna come get you.
Where you die. If so, I've noticed quite a lot of like, if you can drive or if you have a boyfriend who drives, probably die.
Don't get into your boyfriend's van because you're gonna die.
Don't live anywhere where there might be power tools, axes, or machetes. Don't live anywhere near a costume store. That's rule number one.
So then from the 80s slasher, we got kind of, obviously it was developed from like Black Christmas and Halloween, but in the 80s it really solidified this idea of the final girl. Now I have done an episode on Final Girl, but let's kind of look at the 80s final girl. Do you think it is a feminist theory, or do you think it is a misogynistic one when we look at 80s slashers?
So I think it is something that you, like I say, with a lot of this, you can kind of interpret it either way. And I think the movies that we're going to discuss a little bit later as well kind of bring in how it can play out in either way. On one hand, there's the fact that we get to see, like in a positive light, that we get to see teenage girls. To some extent, I was like, we get to see them succeeding. I mean, when you come down to it, they overcome like basically insurmountable odds, often, you know, like unkillable monsters again and again and again, and they still come out on top. They survive, and it says something to me, and always has said something about you know, the resilience and importance of teenage girls, because like, you know, there's so much of like teen girls as a you know, as an audience, both as an audience for media and as consumers of media, that's just kind of constantly swept under the rug. Like if you think about the fact that anything that's marketed specifically towards teen girls is seen as a sort of less than, and I mean, it's that kind of popular culture versus elite culture thing. I think getting to see in slasher movies because normally we're seeing through the eyes of the final girl, and that idea of getting to see, to some extent, everyday life as a teenage girl, the concerns, actually getting to see that represented is great. However, you do also have the thing of, normally we might be dealing with a group of teenage girls. We're not normally just dealing with a single teenage girl. It's normally that idea. The problem arises where the single teenage girl that survives is virginal or nerdy, or it's that idea that any kind of, well, effectively what could be construed as anyone with any kind of moral failing, or who doesn't meet the norm or the desired ideal, is therefore expendable.
Yeah.
And I think that also says a lot about how, you know, on one hand, all of the stuff that I said about how we get to see the lives of teenage girls is kind of aspirational, whereas I think that concept of all of these other teenage girls that get killed off are basically, they're disposable. And that's how I think a lot of, you know, teenage girls, and to a larger extent women, get treated as audiences, and in a lot of other ways. And so I think we kind of have this perfect storm of, it's got the final girl as a trope has so much potential for, you know, for giving us strong female characters, but it also runs the risk of reinforcing these ideals of, you know, very largely very misogynistic and kind of rooted in a like Christian morality sense, basically, that you know, if you have to be you have to be virginal, or you have to be this, or something bad is going to happen to you, and the only way you can overcome this is by continuing to be good and virtuous. And I think it's really interesting that now I think we're getting, particularly with a lot of kind of renewed, because I feel like there's a renewed interest in slasher movies now, like with the reboots, the kind of new Halloween franchise. Like, you know, we actually get to see the ideas of what we start to get people asking, like, what would the aftermath of that be in a more realistic sense, and actually saying, like, yeah, but what about these girls who are completely not equipped to deal with this horrible traumatic experience that's happened to them? What does that do to somebody? And I think that's, and even then, you know, seeing about, like, it brings us all these questions about resilience and about what, you know, what these kind of societal ideals of femininity are. Because I mean, sometimes you kind of get that where, like, the final girl will have a little bit more of a tomboyish quality than necessarily her friends. So we get a lot of mixed messages. As a general rule, I think that it can be something that's very empowering, but it fundamentally comes down to the execution and those particular, like, how does the final girl relate to the rest of the world around her in the film, and what does that film tell us about the final girl? So it's all, the part of me is like, it's always down to context, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I always found it very funny that, you know, back in the 80s, there was obviously like mothers groups and all these and censors, and, you know, they went mad over like the slashers and obviously like the video nasties, and it was going to corrupt today's youth and blah 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 blah, when really at the heart of it, it was, as you said, a Christian centric morality fable.
Yeah,
you know.
And I mean, even that way is like, it's so easy to examine, like, by comparison to like old Christian parables or like myths that have like a kind of Christian aspect, where it's that idea of the stalking and killing, or the effectively blighting of a community because they're not virtuous. And I mean, that really comes in, like, because that's fundamentally what it is, where it's never like these slasher movies, it's about spree killing. It's about killing en masse. It's not about, you know, gonna just get that one guy is not that guy. That's never what we see in a slasher. It's about that idea of the effect that it has on both on a, you know, we don't so much see what happens to the community. You know, it is that idea that, well, we're going to wipe out this community is somehow at fault, and this one person is going to survive because they're good.
So let's start off with our movies, though. I'm going to let you go first. So why don't you introduce the movie that you chose and give us a brief synopsis of it?
So I am going to be speaking about The House on Sorority Row, which is 1982, or was released in 1982. It was directed by Mark Rosman, and to give as brief a synopsis as I can, it tells the story of 7 sorority sisters who are decide to throw a graduation party. So it is, I think it's either June or July the 19th. It's normally the night that they're kicked out of their sorority house, but they decide to stay on for a few days and host their graduation party. They're very cranky sorority mother. So like basically kind of like a ban on tea. Who's like the older kind of middle-aged woman who looks after the house and makes sure the girls are well behaved, is completely unimpressed by this, and they decide to play a prank on her that goes horribly wrong and are then left to face the fatal consequences. Do I go into more?
Yes, you can go
into more detail. So these consequences are, of course, the prank, of course, goes wrong. These 7 of the best and brightest young ladies, I think their Theta is their sorority, accidentally murder their sorority mom. They just straight up shoot her. In a pool.
I like the way that they were like, oh, I thought it was just blanks, and you're like, come on, you know, if there's a bullet in a gun.
They accidentally shoot one of their own friends in the leg while they're doing the prank as well. And so Mrs. Slater walks with a cane, a very elaborate cane with a pointy swallow thing on it, and they float that out into the filthy pool out the back of the sorority house and, you know, hold her at gunpoint to make her go and get it because she's cranky and has been horrible to them the last 4 years. The gun goes off, they accidentally kill her, and they're left trying to dispose of the body. They then go on with their graduation party.
As you do.
Hiding a body at the bottom of the pool. However, over the course of the party, it becomes apparent that the body is no longer in the pool, which leads them to believe that Mrs. Slater was in fact not dead when they put her back in there and, you know, tie her up in a blanket. Fine. So when some of their numbers start to go missing and turn up dead in increasingly horrible ways over the course of the very, very extra graduation party that they're throwing, they suspect that it's Mrs. Slater, and little do they suspect that there might just be somebody else in the house seeking revenge. But yeah, so that's the house on Sorority Row. It is very much it's very trashy horror, you know, it's a completely formulaic 1980s slasher. We quite literally have our lineup of who's going to be picked off introduced to us within the first 10 minutes. We have 7 girls. We have their unfortunate sorority mom, and we have, you know, quite early on established some of those things that we were discussing, where we have like, you know, the first of them that we meet is this kind of like a little bit more quiet, nervous girl called Katie, who is with her mum packing up her bags, and she decides she's going to stay. She's going to go home, but then at the last minute she decides to stay for the party. And that gives us kind of, if you're familiar with the genre, she gives us like straight away top tier final girl vibes. And you know, as we go on, we meet you know, the rest of the cast. There's Vicky, who I think is introduced with her boyfriend, so we know that like, oh, she could be at risk. We've got like, you know, there's a lot of like very stereotypical kind of American college girls. Like we have I think her name is Morgan, who is quite literally just the stereotype dumb blonde character, where like she's the butt of the joke for everybody else, but it's also that kind of thing of being like, where's the body gone? A lot. And, you know, it's those kind of things that also make it, you know, from, while you can watch it as it's just a camp 1980s horror, it also can just get on your nerves. Quite a bit. Like, it is that thing where there's definitely stuff to, it's very much of its time, but unfortunately the views that that kind of are reinforced in its use of those stereotypes, unfortunately they did not remain in the 1980s. Oh, that they did. But yeah, I don't know, what were your thoughts on?
I actually didn't mind the house on Sorority Row. Like, I went into it, you know, mindless and just like, it's an 80s slasher. But compared to a lot of the other ones I watched, like I also watched Prom Night, which is awful, even though it's got Jamie Lee Curtis in it. It is awful. It's awful.
Awful.
And like nothing happens for the first hour and a half, and you're just like, this is so boring. So I thought that the fact that the house on Sorority Row really set up the story from the get-go.
Yeah.
I was like, I can get behind this. I know what's going on. It's straightforward. You know, I don't have to be trying to figure out hidden meanings in this film. It's grand.
Yeah. It ain't.
Yeah. I appreciated it because it was a lot of other films of the time, like The Burning, like the one we're going to be talking about afterwards. It's just all boobs. Like there's so many boobs, and you're just like, I am now boob blind. Like boobs.
I lost count of the number of boobs because I did a recap watch of each of these like back last night, and I genuinely lost count of the boobs.
Yeah. Whereas the house on Sorority Row, I think there's only like 1 or 2 kind of boob shots, and I was like, yeah, I can get behind that. That's okay.
And for this one as well, I found like they were I was basically saying they're diegetic boob shots. I was like, I feel like a knob. Pardon my language, but here we are. Is it always felt to some extent like a little bit kind of natural, like we're not seeing anything, there's not any sort of gratuitous nudity in any way that isn't like that is that kind of male gazy kind of way. Like it's there are girls getting changed in their rooms, or you know, they're getting it on with their partners, you know. It makes sense. There's never just a straight up like, oh, we're gonna have like, and especially because so much of the movie also revolves around a pool. There would have been plenty of opportunities to say, oh, we're just gonna have them doing like a pool party, whereas like, you know, they pointedly didn't. I think we actually see more male nudity than we do female nudity, because we see all of like the kind of frat boys jumping into the pool and stripping off, and you know, swimming in this horrible, because they make the pool look really gross as well. The idea is Mrs. Slater won't pay to have the pool cleaned because the girls don't use it. As they said, they were like, well, we don't use it because it's nasty, and or something to that kind of end. And it's green, and there's algae in it, and there's like just unknowable detritus in this pool, and they actually use it. It gets used quite a lot of characters in and out, and bodies being dumped in it.
I mean, it kind of I feel like the pool kind of represented the rest of the house, that, you know, that it has a murky undertone to it. You can't see what's actually inside it, like the house.
You can't hide that. Like whatever goes down there is going to come up eventually. As poor Vicky, Diane, Jeannie, I can't remember all of their names. I was about to list Vicky and Diane again. Morgan, I think Morgan. And I do, like, there is a lot about it. And like, as you say, that like kind of idea of the murky, like what's going on, because for a while, I think it's one of those movies that if you're familiar, as we are now, you know, we've got so many slashers to look back on. When you look back on the genre, it's none of this, there's a lot of things that seem like they were set up to be like, moments, like little shock moments or like surprise reveals, that when you're familiar with the genre, as you know, audiences are now, they're just like, you know, we saw that coming, like you can see it from a mile off. But for an audience watching it in 1982, there's some of the stuff that I feel like I was like, they did tease that out quite well. Like, you know, if we're safe to go into spoilers, you know, the movie starts with a prequel set in I think it's 1961, where we see Mrs. Slater, the sorority mom, is in labor, and the doctor is being called. It's a difficult labor. We don't see what happens. We just see that when her procedure is finished, the doctor is kind of like morose and sits down beside her, and then we just have a pan out and a really good scream, like a real good scream, where she's just screaming no. So we don't know what's happened, and again they tease that out throughout the movie, of like it always refers back to her difficult labor. And you know, the movie is leading us to think that this is the psychological effects of the labor on Mrs. Slater, whereas as we learn later on, she did in fact have a child.
Yes.
Eric. It feels like a really normal name. Like I genuinely that's actually a good point, where now that I'm thinking about it, I was like, slashers do have very slasher villains have quite normal names, which
They really do. You know, trying kind of to signify that sometimes people are the monsters.
Exactly. And I mean, it is to some extent, I think you have that kind of trend as well of the kind of growing prolific, or at least I was about to say prolificness, I don't even know, is that the right word? The kind of growing status or like public acknowledgement of like, you know, like serial killers, like the growing, like how that was growing as a definition from like law enforcement perspectives and, you know, psychological studies perspectives, like that idea that a person is capable of that, you know, or not a person or any person, but there are people that are capable of that. And in many cases they don't have to be. It doesn't even, it's scary when it's a man behind a mask, but it doesn't have to be a man behind a mask. And I think for a lot of this movie, we don't actually, I was really interested because there's a point in this movie where they swap between no mask and mask. So we don't ever get to fully see. It's kind of a bit similar to
Black Christmas.
In that way, where you have like in the one scene where we would see a full face, that's actually the scene where we're seeing a mask. And I think I actually kind of love when you do get a slasher that doesn't have a masked murderer, you're like, oh, we can see his face. How novel.
So how did you feel about the gore in this film? I loved it. One of my favorite scenes was the head in the toilet.
Yes, I hit the roof when like rewatching it over the head in the toilet. I think this movie in particular, out of the two that we were talking about this episode, is like, I think almost the more clearly influenced by Italian giallo, in that there's some scenes in particular that are just so weird and giallo-esque. Like there's a scene where Katie has been given tranquilizers by Dr. Beck, unsolicited tranquilizers. Dr. Beck is also a bad guy.
I'm just going to drug you and use you as bait.
Drugged a teenager, like you just basically drugged a 19-year-old and are acting like it's no big deal. But also, like, there was this really, like, actually kind of gorgeous to look at, like the lighting that they chose in the room when Dr. Beck is effectively using Katie as bait, and he straight up tells her, "You were the bait," and she begins to hallucinate, and the lighting shifts to these like beautiful green and purple washes, and we get this kind of, like, what I'm actually thinking of in my head is a weird dream ballet of, like, you know, Mrs. Slater's cane just kind of like dancing, and then all of her dead sorority sisters and Mrs. Slater herself, you know, kind of appearing one by one and then in formation. And that was so out of giallo, and the gore in this movie is just so deliciously giallo. It's that paint blood, like there's nothing about it that is remotely realistic and blood like. It's so vividly red. It's very, like, in my mind it's kind of that line between that kind of combination of like giallo and Hammer horror blood, where it's absolutely not ketchup, it's just watered down paint. And there was so much of it that we get to see. Like, I really loved that the cane was the weapon. Like, I think there was something really, like, I was like, there were occasional inserts of other weapons being used, but I love that we got to see, like, because it was kind of foreshadowed, that weird bird where it's like got that kind of curved pointy swallowtail, and Mrs. Slater, before anything untoward happens, slashes slashes one of the Vicky's waterbed. She finds Vicky having sex in, you know, the sorority house, and she slashes her water mattress. Side note, I did also appreciate that they specifically showed, like, the sex scene, they specifically included condoms. I appreciated the fact. I was like, go Vicky.
Yeah, good for you.
This is good. We want this representation. But it's that the fact that we kind of had that little foreshadowing of seeing it, and then the actual bird part is, I very rarely used as the weapon. He stabs them with the floor part of the cane, and obviously, you know, there's no way not to read how, like, you know, with most slasher weapons,
Yes.
is that incredibly
phallic. Yes.
And I think this one, to be fair, The House on Sorority Row is even less than the movie we're going to talk about next. But there is that kind of like, and again, it ties in really nicely with that, you know, that, you know, that kind of misleading, is it Mrs. Slater killing the girls? Is there something else going on? But I love that kind of, and also the fact that it gives you that little visceral kick because it's a cane, you know, it's not sharp, like, you know, that there's a level of like force going into that.
And also in this film we see another slasher trope that kind of came out obviously with Friday the 13th, the idea of the possibility of a monstrous mother. So how do you feel about this kind of inclusion in this film in particular, but in 80s slasher in general? Why do you think it kind of came about?
I think, again, like, I don't want to keep harping on the same thing. I think a lot of it is, there's a few reasons, like on a kind of cultural standpoint, where you kind of still have that, like I said, the kind of pushback against the idea of like the kind of summer of love and that revolution, where you get that idea that that generation are now having children and would somehow be like remiss parents or failing in some sense as parents as a result of having that loosening of the strict morals, and then, you know, the fact that religion was no longer the kind of central you know, kind of factor in a lot of American homes. But there was also, alongside that, the kind of, with the kind of an increased interest in like women's movements and women's rights movements, and in the States there was a kind of also kind of move to just as a general rule, like, kind of demonize women, but also that idea that like, oh, these people can't make fit you know, they can't make fit parents in the tradition, in that because they don't fit into that like cookie cutter traditional home, that therefore they couldn't, you know, they were somehow unfit or somehow wanting as mothers. I mean, as well as those kind of like 80s specific things, and I mean, as well as that, you also have that idea of the overly, because to some extent there's the overly controlling mother, like you were saying with the, you know, the I'm thinking like Moms Against Satanism kind of vibe, where you have these mothers who were like Carrie's mom, these ideas like fully moralizing mothers, and like the idea that you could also go, while, you know, slashers as a whole were kind of moralizing, that the moralizing, if it went too far, could push someone over the edge. I think, as well as those being like maybe more like 80s specific things, I mean, I think that trend kind of continues to run through horror. But while that might be something period specific, we also have historically, like, kind of, I won't even limit it to Western. I think as a whole, throughout like global mythology and stuff like that, the idea of the monstrous mother is so prolific. Like, I mean, if we think of the one that would immediately jump to mind is Medea, and it's that idea of mothers that are somehow not necessarily physically deformed, but that idea that there's something kind of unhinged about them, and that drives them to you know, commit atrocities, either on their children, like in the case of Medea, she murders her children, or that they then shape their children into monsters. And that idea that it was somehow inherent, like there's loads of stuff, you know, from my own research in like, which would focus on the 17th century, there's a huge amount of like really, really interesting, like, not actually scientific, but their understanding of the body at the time, a very flawed understanding, I need to make that clear. Like a lot of beliefs they had about like this concept of moral pollution that could be passed from mother to child in utero, but also through breastfeeding. And like they use this to rationalize like loads of things, like, you know, like mastitis and you know, any of the complications that come from having a child, and they would use to kind of like continue to use to kind of reinforce that idea. And again, it comes from, you know, it's that kind of Judeo-Christian thing of like that idea of women as kind of the bring, not necessarily the source of evil, but definitely as a gateway or a pathway to corruption. And I think, in slashers, the fact that we have the emphasis on the mother, it just kind of returns to that idea of those kind of pairings where it is, it's mums both and as and with monsters. The idea that the woman was the center of the family unit, where, it was that idea that, the mother didn't, because so much of this kind of idyllic American suburban lifestyle was up until, which was starting to fragment in the 80s, where we started to have an increase of women in the workplace, even before the 80s, of course, but it was the idea of like the working woman was becoming more popularized in the 80s, and working women were becoming more visible. And there was that idea that the woman is somehow responsible for what goes on in the home because, dad's out working. So if something's happened, it must be your mum's fault, or it must come from your mother's side. And it was just another way to effectively place the blame and use women as kind of scapegoats for societal problems, like women and teenagers as scapegoats for societal problems. And even if it were men that were actually committing the crimes.
So would you recommend The House on Sorority Row to horror fans?
I think so. Like I say, there's some of it that you have to take with a pinch of salt. A generous pinch of salt. But from my own perspective, it meets so many of those, like, it's a great kind of exemplar of, to some extent, like, while it might not be the one that would come up first in lists of like best slasher movies, but it is a great exemplar of those tropes, and also how early on those tropes were starting to solidify, because I mean it's 1982 and still very early in the 80s, and these tropes are so very clear cut. And also, like I say, it's also a good one for looking at the relationship between like Giallo and other forms of cinema, and how they all bled into this wonderful mess that is the 80s slasher movie.
Yeah, it was actually named one of the greatest slasher films of all time in 2017. So yeah, I mean, I'd largely agree with you. Obviously it's from the early 80s, so it was just kind of kicking off that wave of slashers, and it does get a lot of influence from Black Christmas, which is one of the godfathers of the slasher film. As you said, it incorporates the Giallo, and I just think it's a really interesting, when you think about 80s slashers, you do think of Friday the 13th. But I think it's important to look at the less massively franchised horror films of that time to really kind of know what was actually going on at that time, not only within horror but within society. And I really feel that The House on Sorority Row does a really good job of that. So let's move on to the one that I chose. Now, I originally was like, maybe I'll go for Prom Night, but then I watched Prom Night and I was like, absolutely not. So I chose The Slumber Party Massacre, which is also known as The Slumber Party Murders in the UK. It is also a 1982 film, directed by Amy Holden Jones, who gave up a chance to work on E.T. to direct this film.
I did not know that.
Yes.
I knew it was Amy Holden Jones, but I didn't know about E.T.
Yes, she was offered an editing job working on E.T., and she was like, no, I'm going to direct this little slasher film here. I bet she was kicking herself.
Honestly, I can't fault her. I cannot fault her.
And it was written by Rita Mae Brown. So it is part of a trilogy, which I didn't watch because I just thought, where can you go from here? It stars Michelle Michaels, Robin Steele, and Michael Viella. And again, it follows a group of women who are getting together for a slumber party. And a bit of a byplot is that there is an escaped killer on the loose in the neighborhood. I kind of like the fact that we've got these two films, and the two of them follow again, more tropes. So we've got one who's like the deranged son of a bad mother living in the house, and then this other one is like an escaped serial killer. So I kind of like that they both follow these tropes. So yeah, it follows these girls. They've all got very generic names like Kim and Susie, probably. And then we also have another girl who is new, and she decides not to go to this slumber party and she's going to stay at home, but they live across the street from each other. And yeah, it's basically these girls again are just being stalked and disemboweled by this serial killer with a massive power drill. Again, another lovely phallic symbol.
I genuinely, like, it is the most like, you couldn't, if you tried, and this is the thing, like, I genuinely, there was a particular still that I actually kind of wanted to take out and print and just look at it every so often whenever I was like, how ridiculous is horror again?
Yeah.
Where he's standing, like, the shot is a low shot and we're looking at, you know, a prospective victim on the floor who's fallen on the floor. The shot is taken from between the killer's legs and he has the drill.
Yes, it was the poster, the theatrical release poster, and it's the shot of, like, from his back, his legs are spread, and then we've got 4 girls all looking up at him with the drill between his legs, and it looks like something out of a porno. It
really does. Like, I was genuinely, like, because I was watching this on, like, I hooked my laptop up to our television in the sitting room, and I was genuinely like, how bad is this going to look if somebody walks in right now? And I'm like,
I was on the bus home yesterday and I was like, oh, I'm just going to give a quick watch to this film. And I put it on and I had to turn it off because I was like, if anyone sitting behind me, like, sees what I'm watching, they're going to be like, what the hell is this girl doing watching porn on the bus? Like,
yeah, it really did. It actually really did have that vibe in a couple of places. But it yo-yoed so, this one I thought was really interesting because it yo-yoed so wildly between, like, either, like, ultra male gazy or, like, not male gazy at all. And it really feels like, you know, it makes you question who had the reins for what parts of the movie and control.
Well, it was written by Rita Mae Brown, who is actually a feminist activist, and she wrote Slumber Party Massacre, the screenplay, as a parody of the 80s slasher. She wanted to turn it on its head. She wanted to kind of show actually how ridiculous and misogynistic the slasher genre actually is. Now, unfortunately, the studios got hold of it and decided that they wanted a very serious, straightforward horror film.
Yeah.
And so, like you said, there really is this pull and push between the male gaze. So we have such a scene as the shower scene when they're showering at school. You're like, no girl showers like that. I'm sorry, but we're not. Like, I think about it from our point of view, like, being cabaret and burlesque artists, and, like, we are in the changing room and we are like, whip the titties out, like, you know, who cares, stick your pasties on, like, nobody really cares. But we're not, like, rubbing ourselves down suggestively and, you know, like,
because even that scene, there was a point towards, like, the latter half of that scene where I was like, oh, this is actually great, because, like, it started without, like, where I was like, oh, this is great. It's not male gazy actually at all. And then it suddenly cut to one of the, I can't remember which of the girls it is because she's from the back, and it just literally the camera goes,
hands down,
and hands back up. And I was like, before that, it was that kind of thing where I was like, okay, these girls are nude, but they are showering. And then at the end of that scene, it kind of returned to that where they're showering, they're just talking, and, like, you know, it's that kind of case of, like, they're showering, you know, like a person shower like you do in the shower, where you can't reach your back. And no one is that flexible. Are they? But it was really disconcerting where it would go between, like, that kind, like I say, that kind of, like, male gaze and absolute lack of it, which was, the lack of it was really nice and refreshing. And then you have those moments that would just ruin it. Like, I was like, no.
Yeah. I mean, and we have like this group of girls, and they like, of course, there's always going to be the bitchy one, and but they still feel like a good unit. They're still friends. They're not like, there's a new girl as well that they want to invite, and they're, the bitchy one's a little bit bitchy towards her, but they're not overtly bitchy. Like, they're not like the girls from Carrie or anything. And it still feels like this like strong female unit. And then we cut to another scene where there's two lads outside the window fucking peeping toms while the girls are getting changed. And it's just like,
that scene, like, I was like, again, I like the nudity itself. I was like, okay, they're girls getting changed. Not, it's not like the count, we're getting like any kind of like anything overtly sleazy by the camera angles. But that whole scene was so extraneous, where I'm that scene is here. Like okay, I can understand if you wanted to have like, okay, if you wanted to illustrate that these boys were being peeping toms so that the girls can run into them later.
Yeah.
Like, there's a way to do that without having to show us this entirely extraneous scene that is very clearly just there.
Yeah.
Because these girls have their tops off. And
yeah. And there's also the character that really got me was the creepy neighbor.
Oh God, yeah.
So Trish, her parents have gone away, and she hosts this slumber party, and her parents have asked Mr. Contant, their neighbor, to check in on her, and he's so creepy. Like, he lets himself into the house and creeps up on her.
I was like, even though I was that kind of case where you're watching it and you're like, okay, he's probably, he's not, we already know that there is a killer on the loose. We already know that this man is probably, he's probably machete fodder, or as the case, grill fodder. But like, it's just, I was like, girl, run! Like, that's that man. And even just the case that he's like, I was just being neighborly. I saw your door was open, so I came in to check, was everything okay, and you weren't here. And I was like,
I mean,
I wanted to call her parents and be like, why did you leave your 18-year-old daughter alone with this weird ass man that lives next door? Right? Why is that the guy that you asked to be your kids?
I mean, the only comeuppance we get is that the two peeping toms and this creepy neighbor both get killed. So you're kind of like, okay, you got what you deserved, kind of.
And I do, like, it's one of those things as well where I did actually appreciate that they kind of did show how uncomfortable that I think it's Trish's house, is it? Like, Trish's house, that like Trish is with that neighbor, where she's like, when her power was like, I was like, this is, because I mean, I'm pretty sure that's something that almost all women that I know can relate to. There's some, that kind of case of going, there's somebody here you're just like, oh dear God, I don't want to have to deal with that person right now. Because someone's been, overstepping boundaries and not respecting personal space. And it is like that case where they just show him where he just is so perfectly creepy. And again, it's one of those where you're hoping the whole time that
so we have this final girl trope as well in this film, but it is the final girls. I found it kind of strange. Like, I didn't really understand the point of including Valerie and her little sister Courtney, who lives across the road. Like, I kind of didn't get it. I was like, what is their point in being there, other than like Valerie is what we think would be the typically good girl. She wants to stay at home, babysit her little sister, and it just felt like it was a bit too forced on that character front. It just didn't make sense. What did you think?
I really felt like it would have made a lot more sense, and it was something that I'm very curious. I would just love to get Rita Mae Brown and just be like, was this what you wrote? Like, get a copy of the original script and go through it. It seemed to me like the fact that they survive, like, it would have made so much more sense if some of the other girls had also survived, because it would be that case to, like, I think the earlier the start of the movie, there's that kind of growing up and literal putting away of childish things, where we see Trish clearing out her bedroom and throwing out her Barbie dolls and stuff like that. And the whole reason Diane keeps saying she doesn't want to invite Valerie is because she wants it to be like just like old times.
Yeah.
And, you know, throughout the movie, we see that it's not just like old times, because, you know, Diane is out, you know, shifting her boyfriend in the car, or, you know, there's all these other things happening that shows that they're growing up. And I think that, like, having that kind of union of these girls, like this group of girls accepting this new girl, would be like a nice way to kind of show that, like, okay, things are different, but we still have each other, kind of, you know. It would be that nice move of solidarity. That I just don't think that we don't actually, I feel like it was intended to create some kind of sense of solidarity, but how it was executed, we actually don't really get that. It just feels kind of a little bit rushed and smushed together. And I mean, as well as that, there were also the sheer number of times that they thought they had him.
I know. I mean, again, I watched quite a few slashers, and I think, like, the amount of times I was like, just kill him, just make sure he's dead, like, just stop throwing things like phones at him. And, like, you know, even in the final scene of House on Sorority Row, where the final girl is trying to kill the killer, and she does something like, she throws the gun at him. She's shooting loads and loads of times. Apparently is a stormtrooper, because she can't fucking hit the guy, even though she's like right in front of him, and she just throws the gun at him, and you're like, what's that gonna do? And it's the same in this. There's a scene where Valerie and one of her friends, Trish and her friend Kim, they barricade themselves in the bedroom, but the killer enters through the window, and they just throw things. I think it's like a phone at him or something.
Because I had this literally written down as, like, I love that's one thing I really, really love about this movie, is how hard the girls fight. Like, there's just a really wonderful vitality about, like, how, like, there none of these girls, and it's something that you kind of see more in, that kind of annoyed me about some of the girls in the House Sorority Row, were obviously, you know, no one wants to get murdered. But it is that kind of case of, like, there was a lot more, like, a lot of the time with a lot of slashers, you see, like, once a female character is caught, they kind of stop fighting. Like, you don't get to see much of a story, or you don't get to see a convincing struggle. And it's that thing where I was like, I really appreciated this one. Like, I was like, those girls fought. They threw everything at them. I was like, they would have thrown the kitchen sink if it was in there. Like, she just picks up, there was like a little vase that she just picks up and, like, chucks at him. And it was that kind of thing where I was like, there's a level of practicality to that I was like, it's so silly, and you know it's not going to do anything. But it is also that moment of, like, you know, that kind of realistic panic moment of going, like, I'm just going to throw anything at him to get him to stop.
But yeah, I always think that, because, you know, at one point they knock him out and they knock the drill out of his hand, and they don't think, right, I'm going to pick this up and, like, hit him. And I just think, like, is that, like, obviously we ask this a lot in zombie films, but, like, what would you do if you were in that exact situation? Would you know to pick up the drill and, like, make sure the guy is dead? Or would you just panic and be like, get me the fuck out of here? Like,
I genuinely wonder. I wonder sometimes. And it is one of those things that I actually kind of love, as, like, taking these two movies together. There was so much that I was like, oh, these are really interesting contrasts. Where, like, if you look at Vicky in the House on Sorority Row, she's a sociopath. Like, she's insane. Like, this is the girl who we initially see, like, when she gets the gun and her boyfriend's trying to explain how to shoot to her, and she just, like, hits everything straight off the bat. She's like, what? Like, it's hard. But the fact that we see her being, like, she's so ruthless, and, like, immediately she's like, you know, she wants to humiliate this woman, and she's willing to do anything to get there. And then when she does admittedly accidentally kill her, she is so, like, practical and ruthless about it, where it's like, this is what we're doing. She is dead. We know she is dead. We're going to dispose of the body. This is how we're going to, and, like, has the whole plan. I feel like she planned it in advance. I feel like Vicky's the real low-down serial killer here. But I do kind of love that in Slumber Party Massacre, we get to see like these slightly more, like, it's that panic, it's that teenage girls not knowing what, and again, it's that kind of case where Vicky kind of takes the reins with the house in Sorority Row, where we get to see this kind of like a different approach to like, what would you do? You just don't know. They're just like, they're trying to be like, I don't want to, you know, they don't want to kill somebody. They've just been seeing people dropping like flies around them. They don't want to see someone dead. I mean, my favorite part of the entire film was where they're sitting there hiding in that they've like locked all the doors, and I think the two boys have gone out to look, and Jackie's like, I'm really hungry, I'm gonna eat that pizza, food makes me feel bad. And they're like, Jackie, no, like, you can't possibly touch a pizza that's near a dead guy. And Jackie's like, I'm gonna eat it. And like, just straight up goes over, lifts the dead pizza guy's hand off and starts eating the pizza, and was like, yeah, I feel better. And I was like, Jackie is maybe my favorite horror. I was like, maybe the most relatable horror film character. I was like, in that situation, I am Jackie. I am going to get the pizza and eat the pizza. I don't know if I'll pick up the drill. I don't know about like, would I, you know, it's that kind of thing of that kind of like moral fiber thing of like, I feel like at this stage in my life, I'd be thorough enough to be like, I will check that this person is definitely dead, or at the very least so incapacitated that they cannot hurt me. But then I would definitely go for the pizza. Like, that's, you know, make sure you're safe, then pizza. Yeah, like, exactly. That's how we roll.
Yeah. So would you recommend Slumber Party Massacre to horror fans?
While it has certain letdowns, like, you know, like you're saying, that kind of weird tone shift that keeps happening between where you can really clearly see what Rita Mae Brown was going for. And then there's also parts where you're like, ew, this is like, it's both everything it literally encapsulates in a single film, everything that is great about slashers and everything that's terrible about them. And for that reason, I would genuinely recommend it, because you can see like when you have that, all of that, like, here's the parts that are really brilliant about this genre, and here's the stuff that is just deeply disappointing. And like, when it shines, it shines. When it shines, and Jackie gets her pizza.
So out of the two movies, which one do you think is better when it comes to kind of encompassing the genre of 80s slasher?
Oh, that's a hard one, because they both have a lot, like, they tick those trope markers so well. I think, like, both from a which movie did I have more fun watching, well, not necessarily, they were both fun watches, but from the one that I was kind of like the one that I was less kind of rolling my eyes throughout was for me the Slumber Party Massacre. I think because it has those moments of the parody bones are still there. Like, there was only so much sleazy, like, messing with it that producers and editors, you know, that the studio could do, and it still has that, like, kind of really good parodic elements of it. It doesn't take itself too seriously, but it also really shows how, like, so early on, the bones of the genre were so, like, what makes a slasher slasher so distinct. And also I just appreciate that the girl gang in Slumber Party Massacre they're my kind of girl gang.
I'm gonna go with House on Sorority Row for me, because I liked a good kind of anonymous masked killer. I mean, obviously we find out right at the very end who it is, but I like a good anonymous killer until the very, very end. Slumber Party Massacre, you see the killer. He's not masked. We know his name, we know his backstory, everything. And I think, like, it just takes away some of the mystery, the ghost ride element, the kind of excitement. And also because I am just a massive Giallo fan, I really appreciated the little Giallo.
Yeah, it's that Giallo. It is a hard. It's a hard. Like now that you've mentioned the Giallo, I'm like, should I change? Should I? But it is a hard choice. I actually think we pick. I actually do think that of all of the 80s slasher movies,
and there's many. There's so many.
Many. I think the reason that in this case it's hard. Like if it was this versus Slumber Party Massacre versus Prom Night, there would be an easy like.
Yeah,
these were like there's good parts in both of these.
Yeah.
What's your worst 80s horror? I want to know now. Like, give me them bad 80s slashers.
Like, I know I keep going on about it, but Prom Night, I was just really disappointed. I was like, what? How can Jamie Lee Curtis go from Halloween to this absolute tripe? Like, the story didn't make sense. The kills were really like, I mean, you didn't really see a lot of the kills. You saw a little bit of gore, and I was just like, meh. And then there was too much disco dancing. So much disco dancing.
That was one thing with the house on Sorority Row. I was like, the actual like full-on 80s hairband that they had in the middle of it was real good.
Yeah. So yeah, I think Prom Night was just a massive disappointment for me.
Yeah. I think I'm going to go with you on that one, because it is that kind of case of like I feel like the pedigree, the horror pedigree that Jamie Lee comes with. When you get like a horror that Jamie Lee is in and it's not great, you're like, oh, it's disappointing now. Why would you do this?
Yeah, I mean, and obviously there's oh god, what is that called? Camp Sleepaway Camp.
Sleepaway Camp. Oh.
Yeah, that's awful in so many levels. It's awful on so many levels.
I genuinely cannot. I can't think about that movie. I might have to go and rewatch it now.
And I think, was there another one, or was this from the 70s? I can't remember whether it was 70s. Oh no, it was 1980, so it was right on the cusp. Although I don't know whether you could class it as a slasher, but Dressed to Kill.
Oh, I watched that recently, and I'm not sure. It's one of those where I'm like, I think I've seen it actually lumped in with Giallo a lot. Where I'm like, it does make sense, but
it was on the cusp. It was very cuspy,
kind of like in that kind of like fun little median point.
Yeah, that kind of concludes our chat on 80s slashers. But before we kind of move on to my usual question I ask everybody, what do you think is the legacy of the 80s slasher?
Oh, I think it's an incredibly strong. I think I think its kind of lasting legacy is that it is the teen horror film. Like the teen horror genre in my mind is the slasher. Like, I know myself, it wasn't something that I watched as a teen, but they capture something that is very quintessentially like young adults.
Yeah.
And again, it is also that like dumb theatricality where it's not, they're not trying to be highbrow. They're not trying to be highbrow, but they're also not trying to, well, when they're done well, they're not trying to be intentionally transparent.
Yeah.
And I think it left, in its very clear-cut set of tropes, it left so much more potential for directors and writers that came later to play with. I mean, I don't think I can think of a single a single other horror genre or subgenre that is so formulaic in so many ways, but has been exploited in so many ways. Like, I think about subsequent movies like the Scream franchise, which actually were one of the like, oddly enough, which in retrospect, not scary at all, but Scream really freaked me out the first time I watched it, because I watched it when I was home alone as a young teenager. It like genuinely had like poor little me very nervous. But when you look at the likes of Scream, or even a personal favorite, Leslie Vernon Behind the Mask, there's so much potential there for subversion and like both subverting people's expectations, but also subverting the messages that drove early slashers. And I think that's something that, you know, we've kind of seen, you know, I know horror kind of comes in, or horror kind of popular horror tropes kind of come in waves, where we had like kind of mid 90s into early 2000s horror, like where we saw a lot of remakes, particularly of those 80s horrors, where you know, it was that idea that you had to update it for it to be relatable, even though the 1980s ones have a certain level of relatability, for, like I say, or at least that idea of for a teen audience, or that idea of, you know, we've all had those moments where someone says they don't want you to go to a party within your earshot and you feel really awkward as hell. Yeah. Or, you know, those kind of things, or, you know, the anxiety of leaving school to go to college, things like that are, you know, they're kind of part of you know, that kind of late teens, early adulthood experience. And so I think being able to play with those fears alongside an actual boogeyman, there's so much to play with there. And there's so much that I hope people continue to exploit. Like, I'd particularly be interested in seeing a lot more in terms of, like, slashers tend to get quite a bad rap, with reason, for the kind of misogynistic overtones. Like, I was going to say undertones, but I was like, it's very explicit.
Very over.
Yeah, it's very overtones. It couldn't be more overtones. I think it's just the tone. And that kind of, I would love to see that being played with more. Like, I would love to see, you know, I know we're starting to, like, there are, you know, a lot more kind of feminist takes on horror, and I love reading feminist interpretations of slasher movies. But I would love to see that translate into the screen more. And that's kind of why I know the last Halloween movie, the 2018 one, got kind of mixed reviews, but I really enjoyed it, because I really liked that idea of, like, we got a lot of women's solidarity in that movie. We got a lot of, like, not necessary, and again, that idea that your girl gang, your final girls don't all have to get along. You don't always have to be best friends with everybody. And I really enjoy that kind of, like, the idea of seeing more and more of that, or even potentially seeing some, you know, I want slasher ladies.
What is your favorite horror film?
That is an excellent question. And when you mentioned you're going to ask me this question, I have been like, what is my favorite horror movie? Can I pick multiple? Like, several. For the sheer fact that today we've been talking a lot about theatricality and just overall ridiculousness and schlockiness, I have a very, very soft spot in my heart for Dracula AD 1973. Okay. Absolute trash. Well, I say it's absolute trash. It's one of those really weird movies that it's got all of the Hammer horror early tropes, and it's by no means am I saying it is a plot-driven masterpiece, Oscar-worthy performance. Like, you know, in terms of contemporary horror, The Witch it's right up there on my list. I've given so many papers on it at conferences that I actually had to, like, ban myself from writing more. I was like, no, you're not allowed to write about The Witch anymore. You've done that 3 times. But I do have a very, very soft spot for Dracula AD 1973. It's just very camp. It's got that vibrant blood, ridiculous. It's got a really funky soundtrack, and it's got Peter Cushing with a funky soundtrack in the back. Like, it's not what I was expecting it to be at all, and I will love it forever.
Okay, so if people want to find you online, where can they do so?
People can find me on Instagram and Twitter, a rarely updated Twitter, at Alice Apparently. If you're more interested in my scholarly updates on Twitter, you can find me at an opera witch. And if you like spooky knitting, you can look up Spook Nook Stitchcraft and see me knit little Mothmen. There are tiny, there's tiny Mothman. If it's there and it's creepy, I will knit it.
Yes.
But yeah, I'd say that's probably the best places to find me, other than, you know, lurking behind the sheets that you have on your line, or just behind that hedge, or in that place under your bed.
So that was my discussion there with Alice apparently / Shauna about 80s slashers, and in particular we chatted about Slumber Party Massacre and House on Sorority Row from 1982. So what is your thought on the 80s slasher? Do you think it is one of the golden ages of horror, and it is your favourite subgenre, and they're all masterpieces of cinematic history, I guess? Or are you a bit like me, where they're kind of all the same, they're kind of a bit exploitative, and you could really take or leave them, you don't care? Let us know on our social media. So that is Instagram and Facebook at What a Scream Podcast, or you can at me on Twitter, what_scream. And then you can also find us on Letterboxd, so you can keep up to date on all the movies that we are covering. And you can also catch me writing for Ghouls magazine, and also Moving Pictures Club, or on my own blog, which is whatascream.wordpress.com. So as always, if you are listening to us on a podcast streaming service such as Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, don't forget to subscribe and to also leave us a review as well. And if you are watching this on YouTube, subscribe there and then hop on over to a podcast streamer service and subscribe there as well, please. It helps us get noticed by new listeners. As always, I hope yous are staying good, and of course, stay horrific. Goodbye. Shouldn't be scared of Dracula. Shouldn't be scared of the mummy.